So it's been a little while since I've done a film review. Obviously with the lockdown, all the cinemas are closed. So I probably won't be doing a review of any new films, but this is a film that I'm going to review that I've watched now about 3 or 4 times. The film is The Lovely Bones. Now, before I get into talking about the film, a little bit of background. I first saw this when I was actually in China 2 years ago. Part of my contract in the apartment was there was all these films kind of set onto the television screen there. Whether it was some sort of Netflix type deal, I don't know what it was, but anyway, that was a good little perk that I had. I could watch all these films, like Western films, on that particular TV set. Now, I've been familiar with this film in terms of I'd heard of it, but admittedly, I'd always been a little put off by, speaking honestly, the title. I thought it just seemed a bit strange, and I didn't think it would be something I was interested in. It just seemed a bit like The Lovely Bones. So it sort of sounds contradictory or something. Like bones aren't lovely. It just so I must admit the title had always found a little off-putting, but I watched the film and it really had a profound effect on me. So when I got back to the UK, I bought a lot of new DVDs and I bought it and now watched it 3 times. I watched it again last night, and every time this film has a very powerful effect. Um, so I'll do a quick sort of synopsis and then some thoughts on the film itself and just issues around it. So it's based on a book by the best-selling author Alice Sebold, 2002 book, um, called The Lovely Bones. It's directed by Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame, and photography took place in Pennsylvania, in New Zealand, and other locations. Um, it wasn't a massive commercial success, and the critics were quite divided. There was also quite um, negative feedback from some sources, which I found I just don't see. I cannot see the rationale of what the criticism was. That it was, I believe one critic put it as a mess. It failed to deliver the source material. Now, I have to emphasize, I haven't read the novel, so I'm really not in a position to compare it against the novel. But purely as a film, I just found it very, very powerful. And there's a few things that make it powerful. I think the story is a compelling one. The cast, the acting was superb. Some of the best performances I've ever seen. Um, Particularly from the young lead, Saoirse Ronan. She actually played the lead role in this film. There on the cover. It also stars Mark Wahlberg, Rachel Weisz, Susan Sarandon, Stanley Tucci, Michael Imperioli, and like I said, Saoirse Ronan in the lead role, with other supporting roles. It's just a very, very unusual film. So, as I always say with these videos, there's going to be some spoilers. Basically, I mean, if you look at the trailer, it's just you think, okay, it's going to be a run-of-the-mill teen romance, like bore fest. If you're like me, like it was kind of boring. But then you hear the intro, or you hear this line that Saoirse Ronan says, "My name is Susie Salmon, like the fish, and when I was 14 years old, I was murdered." And you think, what? Whoa, like that's really unexpected. So the film is, I describe it as a supernatural drama thriller to some extent, but supernatural drama. It's such an unusual film because it has some very, very dark moments, and the subject matter is very dark. It's about child murder, um, and yet cinem cinematically, there's some beautiful scenes as well in terms of the color schemes, in terms of how that's done. The soundtrack's by Brian Eno, who I'm a big fan of. He also incidentally done some of the score for 28 Days Later. I was familiar with Saoirse Ronan from her role in Atonement, where she played the the younger version of Brian Tallis, based on the famous Ian McEwan novel. So if you've seen that film, well, Saoirse Ronan's a big star now. She's an A-lister, but I must say, the more I see of her work, I watched Brooklyn recently. the more of a fan I'm becoming. I'd say she's one of my favorite actors around at the moment, male or female. I think she's very impressive. And when we consider she was only 13 when this was done, it makes her performance all the more powerful. Um, so basically, the film is about this teenage girl, young teenage girl, who is murdered. And she sort of sees how things develop from this kind of limbo. And we follow how her father and her mother take a different approach. Her mother sort of becomes introverted and finds she can no longer deal with it and moves away. Her father is obsessive about solving the case, played by Mark Wahlberg. Um, and Michael Imperioli plays a sort of personal police officer. I don't know what they're called on murder cases, but where they assign a particular police officer to the case. Stanley Tucci, very demanding role. He is the murderer. But what's interesting is it's not immediately. I mean, it's good 24 minutes before you get into that scene. So it's not straight into it. You sort of see her background. You see that on her 14th birthday, she's given this camera, which she loves, and she's taken all these snapshots. It's 1973, so there's a retro feel about the film, but it's not over the top. It's clearly set in the 70s, the styles and that feel to it. But and I wonder, was there any particular reason for that? The 1970s does seem to be an era where there were a lot of serial killers around. I mean, almost every serial killer documentary you go to, it will start in the 70s. It just seems to have been a decade that seemed to have its more share than its fair share of these guys. Um, but Stanley Tucci, that was a very demanding role for him to play that, and he was chilling. I mean, it was a very sinister role, and it's a very dark subject matter when we're talking about child murder. And this was a serial killer, so not just killing one young girl, but seven altogether, with six girls and one woman. Um, just such an unusual film because it cannot be lumped into any single category. You can't say, oh, it's just a drama, or it's just supernatural, or it's just fantasy, because there's a bit of everything. And I can honestly say I have never seen a film like this. It's totally unique, and that's why it stands out. So yeah, it was a lot more compelling than I thought it would be because I really didn't know much about it. If you're wondering, by the way, Susan Sarandon's in a supporting role as the grandmother. But basically, the way it's done, so this local murderer, we assume he's a predator as well, although the film was careful to tone down some of the more suggestive or some of the more darker elements like pedophilia or predatory side. They toned it down. The film's not actually gory, so we don't see any blood, we don't see anything like that. But there is one scene that's particularly shocking and particularly dark. Like I say, Susie Salmon is now in this sort of limbo, not quite heaven, because her soul cannot settle until the man responsible for her murder is brought to justice on some level. It's quite a spiritual film as well. Anyway, there's a scene where she meets another young girl who simply calls herself Holly, and I'm not sure if in the book Susie realizes she's been murdered. Certainly, you get the impression that her friend Holly doesn't realize that. Um, so she's a young Chinese American girl who was also a victim of this man, and she sort of tells her to let it go and sort of get into this world. And it's a beautiful world. It's like a fantasy world, you know. It's like very beautiful colors, rolling meadows. Just really, it's beautiful cinematography. And I guess the fantasy aspect is coming through here with Peter Jackson being the director. But then there's a scene which is an utter contrast. You cannot get more of a contrast, where Susie is sort of brought down to earth again in a sense, and she gradually sees his other victims. So it says like Flora Hernandez, age 13, murdered in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Um, and I forgot all the names of the other victims, but basically it's a span lasting from 1960 to 1973, with Susie being the last victim. Um, Slightly unusual thing in terms of serial killers. So this may be a little bit off the reality insofar as his first victim was a landlady, an adult woman. Usually with serial killers tend to stick to one demographic, either all male or all female, all young, all older. Serial killers don't tend to mix their victims in that way, but anyway, that's not here or there. It may actually be to indicate that he's getting even more depraved, targeting children. You know, it's evil enough killing a woman, but then killing young girls as well. But the way that scene is done, it's very chilling because you see their bodies. It's not gory per se, it's not bloody, but and you don't see any of the murders directly. Incidentally, I should say, Susie's actual murder you don't see. So you see this guy played by Stanley Tucci, kind of Mr. Harvey, it's called, invite her into this little hut he's built under the ground. And Susie's not a very naive kid. She's quite smart, but she is interested in this. And then when you see the tone change, when you see Mr. Harvey talking to her in this underground there, it is very, very sinister. But you don't actually see him directly murder her. You see her try to escape. And then you basically see what we assume is her ghost running past a classmate. Now, a backdrop in this film, there's a few other things I want to point out. Like I say, her mother just found it too overwhelming and she dealt with grief in a different way and decided to move to California. Um, I don't know what state it's set in. I think it's Pennsylvania, somewhere in New England anyway, or that northeast region. Um, but her father, like I said, deals with it in a very different way. He becomes obsessed about solving this. And there's one scene where it's very powerful. He clicks that it is indeed his neighbour, Mr. Harvey, and he'd overlooked it before. He'd been focusing on oddballs in the neighbourhood, but he'd overlooked Mr. Harvey. And there's a scene where he's looking at the film reels, the undeveloped film reels from his daughter's camera, and he realizes it sort of like flashes a memory. Meanwhile, you see Susan in what we sort of assume is this limbo, and she's sort of trying to reach out to her father. So there's this spiritual connection between father and daughter, and it's basically works it out, and he tries to barge into Mr. Harvey's house. It's quite a dramatic scene, but very powerful acting. Um, I have to say, well, Mark Wahlberg as an actor, I think he sort of goes up and down. I compare him to Nicolas Cage in that sense. I don't think he's universally great as an actor, but I would say this was one of his best performances, if not his best performance. It really was some powerful work as the grieving father. There's a really harrowing scene where he has a hobby of putting little ships in glass bottles, and he done that with his daughter. Him and his daughter were very close, although he has another daughter. Um, and he's just he breaks down in despair and he smashes up all his glass ships. But he saves one and he looks at it. Then he lights a candle, and it's a spiritual connection with father and daughter. Um, what else can I say? Like I said, the other victims have kind of they're now in this fully in this limbo. We're really in heaven. But Susie is still her soul isn't settled. And there's one scene where she's very angry about the fact this man who murdered her is basically roaming around, and you see her young love interest. He's growing up, her sister's growing up, her classmates growing up, um, and time is moving on. But her father does not give up, and there's one scene which is quite dramatic, where he sort of decides to be a vigilante. He gets a baseball bat and ostensibly he's going to basically either kill or severely beat up Mr. Harvey, but there's a mistake and he ends up accidentally grabbing a girl, and the girl's boyfriend thinks he's a predator. And it's sort of, I think the idea of the scene is to sort of show the recklessness of raw anger. And Susie is watching all of this. It's just it's in a cornfield, just an incredibly powerful scene. And then she realizes she has to let her anger go because it's consuming her father and destroying his life. But basically, and again, this is a spoiler, the film ends where Harvey has young Susie's body in this kind of refrigerator, and there's a local sinkhole where everyone kind of throws their rubbish into, and he wants to get rid of this. He wants to get rid of the evidence, basically. And you sort of see Susie gradually accept her fate that then she goes to heaven. And you sort of think, well, what the hell? Harvey's escaped justice. He's got rid of the evidence. He's escaped justice. It's destroyed all these lives. But basically, he is. Sometime later, he's in this kind of car park. It's winter time, and this icicle breaks off a tree and hits him on the shoulder. And he staggers back and falls down a hillside and dies. Some think he got off a bit lightly. I do. He died within about 10 seconds. Compared to the pain he caused seven families, it's bit of an easy way out. But basically, that end scene, you see Suzu in heaven with the others. But it's just, there's certain parts of the film, like when she says this is 13-year-old, I forget the character's real name, but her friend Holly, she liked to be known as Holly. She was waiting for her father to lock up when she disappeared. And it's just, it's really harrowing because stuff does happen in the real world. There are evil people out there who that's why I find it so powerful. There's a strong supernatural element to the film. It's a pity it didn't do that well with critics. I really thought it was a unique film, and I would strongly, strongly recommend it. Um, it is quite harrowing in scenes, like I say, not gory exactly, but profoundly sad, and yet it's not all one big depressing film. There are happy moments. Cinematically, beautiful soundtrack. There's also just moments that are almost when she's in the limbo, borderline heaven. It's almost happy. It's almost like okay, she's finding peace, but she can't really because her family haven't found peace. There's one scene, incidentally, I almost forgot, where her sister, who is now growing older than her, is actually in Mr. Harvey's house and she's found evidence, but she decides not to give it to her parents because her mum has come back, her grandmother's there, and um, Harvey is eventually found out and he tries to relocate. And we assume that scene with the icicles in a totally different location. There's a few plot holes in the film. For example, after Susie's sister kind of shows the evidence to her parents and the police, you sort of see the police surrounding Harvey's house. We can only assume he's went completely to another state because otherwise they would have just arrested him. Um, but check it out, The Lovely Bones. It's a very, very powerful film. Incredible performance by Saoirse Ronan and Stanley Tucci and Mark Wahlberg. Those three performances really stand out. Um, I'd say they're sort of the three main characters in the story. There are other supporting roles. I don't know the young guy that plays her love interest, but him and he actually ends up dating this friend, and friend happens to live at the her father runs a sinkhole operation, so she sort of notices things, and she kind of looks at Harvey, and she doesn't know for certain, but she feels very uneasy about this man. And just one more thing I'll say. Apparently, both Stanley Tucci and the family of Saoirse Ronan were very, very reluctant to be involved in this film. Ryan Gosling was initially cast to play her father, but he was seen as too young. He was only 26 at the time. And if he's meant to have a 14-year-old daughter, that wouldn't really have worked. And apparently, he got fired for being doing things without getting Peter Jackson's clearance. But anyway, Wahlberg was superb at this. And Saoirse Ronan, like I say, only 13 at the time, she was incredible. But apparently both her and Stanley Tucci had to kind of ask each other if they're okay. I mean, for Stanley Tucci in particular, to play such a dark role, apparently his wife really didn't want him to take it, and he was deeply reticent about taking it as well. But he did, and it was an incredible performance. I mean, someone had to do it, and it took a. I must admit, I'm not that familiar with Stanley Tucci's work, but if this is anything to go by, incredible. So check it out, The Lovely Bones. I know this is a longer one, but there was a lot to say about this film. Beautiful soundtrack, very haunting. it's beautiful, but it's dark as well because of the subject matter. But it's very spiritual. I mean, I wouldn't want to say it's religious exactly, but clearly there's a heavenly spiritual component to it. Um, Check it out. The Lovely Bones, directed by Peter Jackson, 2009.